to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens. Welcome back to another episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. My name is Leigh Johnson, and as usual, I am joined by my co-host Rick Lee, but unfortunately only my co-host Rick Lee, as Talia is away at a conference. But we do have a special guest with us here today, who we'll tell you about in just a second. And today we are talking about tragic time. Before we get to that, I want to get some drink orders and some rants or raves. So, Rick, since you're the only co-host here, I'm going to go to you first. What are you drinking?
Just a bit of a preamble. I've been trying to introduce new spirits into my drink repertoire. Now I'm getting on rum, and so I would like a honeybee, which is basically a bee's knees, but instead of gin, it has rum.
Ooh.
Nice.
And today I am raving about Janina Wojcinska. Janina was my mother-in-law, and she passed away a few months ago. There's a house being built next door to me, and as is often the case in Chicago, most of the workers are Polish, and so they're speaking Polish, and they're laughing and joking, and one of them said something that just reminded me of her and her sense of humor. And really, in the end, I wouldn't speak Polish today if it weren't for her, because she spoke no English and we spent a lot of time together, especially watching telenovelas from Central and South America. So I am raving about the life of Janina Wojcinska.
And who's that you got there sitting beside you?
Well, sitting here is my dear friend and colleague, Sean Kirkland. He's a professor of philosophy at DePaul University, and just to make other academic philosophers jealous, let me point out that Sean is the fourth colleague we've had on the podcast. Now, I think Sean would agree that we are extremely lucky to have a department that's filled with just really fantastic philosophers who also, for the most part, happen to be incredibly nice people.
Indeed.
Sean works primarily in ancient Greek philosophy, but also in contemporary continental philosophy, phenomenology in particular. He's the author of several books. I'll just name a few. One is The Ontology of Socratic Questioning and Plato's Early Dialogues. That's SUNY Press 2012. Heidegger's Destruction of Aristotle. That's Northwestern University Press 2023. And central to our conversation today, Aristotle and Tragic Temporality, which was published in the Cycle series at our friends Edinburgh University Press. Sean's currently working on projects related to Friedrich Nietzsche, and he's finishing a monograph on Nietzsche's philosophy in the tragic age of the Greeks. That'll be published also by Edinburgh in their Critical Guides to Nietzsche series. And he's translating, along with Andrew Mitchell, Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy and other early writings. And that will appear in a series that Stanford is putting out, The Complete Works of Friedrich Nietzsche, translated into English. Now, Sean and I have had many, many conversations in many, many bars, often along with our colleagues Will McNeil and Liam Heenahan, but I'm really glad to welcome him to this hotel bar to talk about the topic of tragic time. But before we do that, Sean, we need to know, what are you drinking, and are you ranting or raving?
First of all, it's great to be here. Love the show. Thank you so much for having me. Well, I thought, what's more old-fashioned than Aristotle, so I'm drinking an old-fashioned.
Nice.
I guess I'd like to rave today about pandemic philosophy kids. Since the pandemic, we've been hearing about so many of the unanticipated consequences of this virus, the actual health consequences of the coronavirus, the consequences for the social fabric of our society, our ability to participate in social life, our mental health, our resilience, and a lot of very scary or at least anxiety-producing consequences of the pandemic. One thing that I noticed since the pandemic is that in the last few years, I've had a statistically significant number of really exceptionally good philosophy students in my classes. And it turns out that I think the cause of it, just anecdotally and speaking with these kids, is that during those few years of the pandemic when other people were trying to get their head around sourdough baking or adopting chickens, There were a number of high school students across the country who were just pouring themselves into philosophy in whatever way they had available to them. And of course, as autodidacts, it's usually a pretty idiosyncratic philosophical background, but philosophy needs idiosyncrasy and really requires it, and it's better for it. So I've got a student who just knows everything there is to know about mysticism, and another one who knows everything there is to know about, of all things, Jacques Lacan. So I've got a number of these kids in my class now, and it's really been one of the kind of high points of my career, teaching these students since the pandemic. So.
Nice.
Leigh, what about you? What are you drinking, and are you ranting or raving?
I am just going to have a dirty martini today, and I am raving about protest songs. When you think about protest songs, we tend to go back to the 60s or even before. And there are, of course, a lot of people that I could call out among the greats of protest singers. You know, obviously Bob Dylan, Nina Simone, Billie Holiday, Marvin Gaye, the staple singers. But today I'm going to point out Woody Guthrie.
Amazing.
And in particular, I wanted to rave about his song, All You Fascists Bound to Lose.
Well, I'm going to tell you fascists, you may be surprised. People in this world are getting organized. You're bound to lose. You fascists bound to lose. All you fascists bound to lose. I said, all you fascists bound to lose. Yes, sir. All you fascists bound to lose. You're bound to lose.
Nice.
You fascists bound to lose.
That's great.
It's a very simple folk song. It's quite straightforward in its message, which, by the way, is right there in the title, that all you fascists are bound to lose. I've been finding a lot of comfort in going back to some of these songs, and I really encourage everyone else to do the same. So today, as we mentioned, we are going to be talking about tragic temporality, which we're actually taking from Sean Kirkland's most recent book, which I'm sure we're going to discuss at length today. But Rick, why don't you set this conversation up for us?
Regular listeners might remember that in a previous episode, we discussed various philosophical concepts of time. We talked about clock time, we talked about mechanical time, we talked about experiential time. But maybe there's another way in which time happens. As they say in The Life of Brian, consider the birds. My mom, my former partner, and I often take walks in Humboldt Park near where we live. And as we record this right now, it's springtime, and so ducks and geese and other birds are either pairing up, or they're sitting on eggs, or they're rearing young chicks. We can say for sure that while the birds are pairing, staring deeply into one another's eyes, the offspring do not exist. We can also probably say that the offspring don't exist when they're just eggs. We might say that a duck isn't fully, completely a duck as a little fluffy chick. But we always say that a mature duck is a duck. It's fully, actually, and maybe completely a duck. Now, this is only one way to think about what I might call the time of life. But let's look at the adult ducks. They need to eat, to fly away from danger, to breathe. In short, they need to change in all sorts of ways in order to maintain themselves just as what they are. In other words, life is, by definition, stretched along between a beginning that is receding back into the past and a kind of goal, being a duck, for example. Now, what's weird here is that these two moments, this past origin and this future goal, don't really exist in the usual sense of the word exist. But they make up what it is to be living and what living things are in this weird time in which they're present when it is made up, at least in part, by what it is not. Okay, now add to this a complication of living, namely living as a political animal. That is, as an animal who needs to plan and deliberate before acting, but one who is also extremely prone to error. And not just the error of thinking that a wax apple is an apple, but the error of not noticing that the very thing I am working toward is catastrophic for me. That's the stuff of human life, but it's also the stuff of tragedy. So this week, we'll talk with Professor Sean Kirkland about this tragic time, or as philosophers say, tragic temporality, which I would say is a phrase that in itself is tragic. When I was introducing the topic, I used this phrase, the time of life, and feel free to disagree with that and say that it confuses things. But Sean, you uncover this in your reading of Aristotle's book, The Physics. And I'm wondering, can you give us some clarity on how something that is not, in some real sense, something that's a past or a future, how does that come to be crucial in the way what is, or at least appears?
I think it is a helpful phrase, actually, and it isn't one that I use in the book, but in retrospect, after your introduction, I can see how it really fits and names a certain dynamic way of existing that I think Aristotle is extremely focused on in the physics and then also in his biological and zoological works. For Aristotle, the way that a natural being, which for him is always a living being, so a plant, an animal, a human, the way a natural being accomplishes its being is, in a sense, paradigmatic of the way all beings are, even artifacts, so a temple, a table, a chalice.
You forgot chairs.
Yeah, I got to beat all of them in there. The way in which a living thing unfolds out of its past and unfolds toward its future by unifying its parts and their individual functions into the sustaining, organizing activity of living is the same thing that's going on in a non-living artifact that emerged out of a craft person's activity and that is organized toward serving some function, say providing a place to worship the divine or a surface on which to eat a meal, a vessel to hold wine, or an old-fashioned. I wish I was drinking my old-fashioned out of a chalice right now. Too bad. Missed opportunity. But I think important here is this way of unfolding out of a past and toward a future, this ecstatic way of being from the Greek ekstatikon, a word Aristotle uses to describe all motion and change, and which literally means something like standing out, a way of being stretched out beyond oneself toward one's past and one's future. And that is, I would say, the phenomenal content of what Aristotle observes about how natural things or living things especially accomplish their being, which we then retrospectively think of as his often criticized teleological view of nature.
What I really appreciate about your reading of this being stretched along, you emphasize this point of origin somewhere in the past, and then this goal, or telos is the Greek word there. Most of the people who focus on telos want to criticize Aristotle for saying, look, nothing is what it is. It's always like waiting for some future. One of my teachers in graduate school, Rainer Schurmann, used to refer to this as a teleocracy. But in a way, you kind of tame this goal or telos and you make it less despotic and more of an activity. Am I reading that right?
I mean, I hadn't thought about it in exactly those terms, but I do think that's true of the way in which telos participates in the being of a natural thing. Living a human life, that telos toward which I'm aimed at when I'm making my decisions and deliberating in just ordinary practical situations, that future goal is at the moment working on me and organizing my way of being. It is, although futural, having a genuine ontological effect on me. It's constituting what I am, even though it exists in the future. And so I would say that it has a kind of initial aspect of being sort of controlling or determining. But if we add to that the fact that, especially for humans, that goal features a certain indeterminacy, a certain unknowability and inaccessibility, it becomes less determinate in its effect, I think, on us, and more of a provocation with a certain openness that's produced by our inability to grasp it completely or definitively.
I really like that description of it as a provocation because I found your claim beautifully unsettling. That change for Aristotle is by nature ecstatic. Being is always stretching beyond itself, always involved in what is not present. And that strikes me as both incredibly intuitive and at the same time deeply counterintuitive. And so I suppose what I want to ask is, what does it mean to say that non-being is not just tolerated by Aristotle, but ontologically necessary?
That's a great question, Leigh. Yeah, it is really fascinating. And I think you're right to mark a certain resistance that we naturally, or I don't know about naturally, but given our historical situation, I would say, we inevitably have toward this suggestion that non-being has a kind of ontological legitimacy. I think this does go back to what Heidegger and Derrida and others have kind of diagnosed as this commitment in Western thought since the classical age of Greek philosophy to a metaphysics of presence. And the idea that those Greek thinkers posed the question of what it means to be anything at all, not what it means to be a human or what it means to be a living thing, but what it means to be something at all. And they came up with this idea that to be something is to be present, meaning to be something is to be present now in the present moment, and what is in the past no longer is, and what is in the future is not yet. So those are regions of non-being. And they came up with the idea that what is present in the sense of being present and available in principle to human inquiry, study, understanding, and ultimately mastery. And that reduction of what it means to being present organizes the whole subsequent history of Western thought all the way down to us, such that when we find on the Aristotelian page, which I think we do, a remaining appreciation for the ontological effect of non-being, that is to say, the past origin of a given thing and its future aim, and an acknowledgement of their ontological legitimacy, it's sort of disturbing for us. How can they have an ontological status if they are in the past or in the future?
For listeners who may not have read your book yet, you open by saying Aristotle is not a modern philosopher, and then spend a good amount of energy proving that that's not a throwaway line, I think.
That's right.
And I want to get at exactly that point. I was really struck by this claim that the modern misreading of Aristotle often relies on this kind of subject-object split that just isn't there in Aristotle. Because I know this is going to probably come up a lot in our conversation, just wanted to give you a chance to kind of walk us through what's at stake in that misinterpretation, not just historically, but philosophically.
I do think that we have this tendency to look back at Aristotle, and because he is the inaugurator in so many ways of our philosophical tradition, because he defines and invents really so many fundamental concepts that organize subsequent Western thought, we find a lot that's sort of familiar there. It's easy for us to then focus on those familiar elements and exclude or fail to notice the moments where his text resists our modern preoccupations and commitments. So we look back at Aristotle, and one of the ways in which we find a modern philosopher at work is we think Aristotle is wrestling with basically a skeptical problem that is introduced into the modern period by Descartes. How do we ensure the content of our subjective experience corresponds accurately to the features of objective reality? And so our questioning philosophically is always organized along the relationship between these two poles, subjective experience and objective reality. What we find if we set that assumption aside and we don't look for that subject-object-oriented inquiry in Aristotle, what we find there is a thinker who's not operating according to those terms. Aristotle doesn't have to eliminate immediate content of subjective experience the way that Descartes does in order to find a firm foundation for a philosophical edifice, a kind of indubitable principle on which to build a philosophical argument about the nature of reality. Aristotle just starts with the way things are showing themselves. And his project isn't to set those initial appearances aside and look for an indubitable principle on which to construct a philosophy. His project is to clarify and compare and interpret the content of that always already appearing world. So I like to say, Leigh, instead of thinking of Aristotle as aiming at even a philosophical rendering of objective reality, instead think of Aristotle as trying to make sense of phenomenal reality. The reality or the world that's always already showing itself in our experience.
Yeah, it's like you're encouraging us to kind of wipe that epistemological tint off of our lenses.
Nice. I'm going to use that.
I remember in a book I wrote, I talked about Occam, and I was talking about the difference between epistemology and metaphysics. I gave it to a friend of mine to read before I sent it to the press. And he just wrote in the margin, Baumgarten, when are we ever going to get out from under his grasp? And his point was really simple, that before, the 17th century, philosophers didn't talk about epistemology as opposed to ontology, as opposed to ethics even. And I think, Sean, This is one thing I appreciate about your book, is that it shows this question about time is a question about being, but that's not different than and independent of a question about doing and a question about acting, therefore a question about being human.
That's right.
What I also appreciate, in addition to your showing that there is no subject-object distinction in Aristotle, is you're showing that our modern focus on causation primarily as the mover of, this thing. And so we will only call something a cause if it did something that then made this thing do the thing it's doing. There are lots of ways to think about causes, and maybe our way of thinking about it is impoverished.
That's absolutely right. And it has led to some peculiar contortionism on the part of Aristotle interpretations to read out his claims about both the originating efficient cause, the moving cause, which is located in the past of a living thing, say the parent oaks of this particular oak, and also a great deal of contortionism trying to read out Aristotle's claims that the futural cause, the aim of living successfully as an oak, which organizes this particular oak tree, is in fact a cause, that it functions as a cause, that it is causing this oak tree to be what it is. And so we find a number of conventional or mainstream readers of Aristotle having to just simply set aside sections of the texts, saying things like, Aristotle doesn't really mean this. Right. There's one section in the commentary on the Posterior Analytics where very learned editor Ross, very famous Aristotle scholar, basically says, Aristotle doesn't understand what a final cause is. And Aristotle invented the final cause, so presumably he should be the authority.
Right.
But yeah, so this is right, that for Aristotle, something that's located in the past and now no longer in the present moment is nonetheless still abidingly having something like a causal effect on the way I am living my life right now as a human. And the humanity that I'm aiming at, which is a futural goal, organizing me from that futural space, is constituting me and causing me to be what I am. That idea is really difficult to approach with our modern conception of basically mechanical causation.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the way that you rehabilitate the teleological in many ways in this text. I mean, you do a pretty bold thing in defending final causality, not in the cheap, everything happens for a reason kind of way,
right,
but as a way to account for how beings are always oriented towards a future that hasn't happened yet. I find your argument really compelling that we've been too quick to discard Aristotle's teleology in modern metaphysics.
Yeah, I think it's kind of an unfortunate feature of the way that teleological argument was sort of taken up in the Middle Ages and then taken up in the early modern period, that it became, I imagine, what Schurman is sort of responding to as a top-down organizing and constraining ultimate goal or ultimate aim. Whereas I think in the text, what we look at or we call teleology, as you were saying, Leigh, really nicely, the phenomenal aspect of living things, that they point toward some aim, they unfold toward that future aim. Aristotle takes that out of the phenomena of living being, and then he finds a structure to explain that phenomenality, how they appear to be that. The way that the oak tree doesn't appear to be just a present thing sitting there, but it presents itself to me as stretching out toward a future aim. It presents itself to me as ready to put out leaves in the spring, and it's not a merely subjective, for Aristotle, imposition on the phenomena, I think.
I want to float something here that I obviously don't have entirely worked out as an idea, but
that's the best.
That's what the bar is for.
That's why they pay me the big bucks. Right. The way you describe the ecstatic character of time, this, as you said, being stretched between a past that's gone and a future that hasn't yet arrived. That's clearly not an epistemology, right? We're getting rid of the subject-object concerns.
Right.
But it also isn't just an ontology. I want to float the idea that maybe it's something closer to a pathology. Like tragic temporality isn't just about structure, it's about vulnerability. And maybe that's why tragedy resonates so deeply. You know, it's tragedy that stages the drama of being temporal, the pain of never fully inhabiting the now. I'm not sure Aristotle would go all the way there, but it does seem like your reading cracks that door open a little bit.
And let me just pile on that, because I started thinking, and here I think you're not going to like where I'm going maybe, is that what Leigh just said points out a different way of understanding being finite than one finds in someone like Heidegger and followers of Heidegger. That is, it's not a being toward death. In fact, in many ways, this temporality you raise that belongs to living things is the absolute antithesis of death, not to say the denial of it, but the finitude emerges, as Leigh was pointing out, in our ability to fuck up and not just make epistemological mistakes, but make life and death mistakes, make real friendship mistakes, make real political mistakes. That's a sense of finitude that seems to emerge from this understanding of time.
Yeah.
It's like temporality isn't a neutral condition. It's something like an existential wound that we all carry.
I like that. I really like that a lot. Yeah, I think this might be a little more interesting at certain levels than some of the things I said in the book about it. But yeah, I really like this idea of a kind of pathology and also pushing back against Heidegger's insistence that what forms or what characterizes our finitude is immediately the most dramatic, all-encompassing possibility of non-existence. I think what tragedy presents us with more often is not the human capacity to cease to exist, but much more the human capacity to err. The Greek word is planein, right? To wander off course. And I think there's a sense that that's really what tragedy for Aristotle in his Poetics, when he sets out his sort of handbook for the composition of tragic, epic, and comedic poetry, the last part, of course, famously being lost, he seems to be saying what we learn in watching a tragedy, what we're presented with, an imitation of, is human praxis, that is, the activity of living our lives, and its inevitable exposure to error and catastrophe. The structure that he finds, I believe, for that exposure to error, that existential wound, Leigh, and that pathos that characterizes the human condition, that is, the capacity to suffer, the capacity to be affected, that openness, I think all of that is what we become aware of when we're watching a tragic protagonist try to engineer their own success and their own happiness and end in catastrophic failure. And I think what for Aristotle is evident there is this exposure to regions of unknowability. That is, on the one hand, my actions are imposed upon me to some extent, determined to some extent, by an infinitely complex past that I'm inheriting, right? So this is what we would think of under the terms of fate, usually, or fatedness in the context of Greek tragedy. But it's really just a past influence, a set of past influences that are working their way out through me, and my inability to understand fully the effect of that past, and then my mirroring inability to understand and anticipate the future consequences of my action. And that's this thing I'm calling tragic temporality that I think Aristotle thinks we're confronted with on the tragic stage. And the last thing I would say is it's something that we see best or most effectively in terms of pedagogy or learning when we see it on stage imitated through a tragic protagonist. If we were aware of it in our actual lived lives, he thinks it would be paralyzing. In the Poetics, he says it wouldn't produce learning, it would produce mania or madness. To feel this sense of total exposure, that woundedness, that openness to influences we can't understand completely and consequences that we can't engineer completely, that would be so disorienting or so disturbing that it's impossible to keep it in mind when you're just trying to get on the train or just trying to go grocery shopping.
Hotel Bar Session listeners, this is Rick Leigh. Do you know what kind of pillow I use or mattress I sleep on? No, of course you don't. And that's because we don't have any of those stupid ads for pillows or mattresses or any other crap that you don't even want. We are supported by you, our listeners. And if you want to keep our late night conversations flowing, why not do the equivalent of buying us a drink? You could subscribe to our podcast at Patreon. That's patreon.com/hotelbarsessions, and you could subscribe at many levels. Hey, there's perks at those levels. You could get a coffee mug, or I might even call you out on an episode, or you could get early access to some of our episodes. There are lots of perks there, and we could really use your help. So go to patreon.com/hotelbarsessions and subscribe at any level you feel comfortable with. In the meantime, we'll see you back at the bar.
Sean, I want to pick up where you left off at the end of the first segment.
Grocery shopping.
I probably do need to pick up there.
Could you pick up a couple of pears for me?
One of the things that really hit me while reading your account of tragedy as this disclosure of temporality is how far this is from what contemporary culture wants tragedy to be. I mean, we're all about catharsis, like in the therapeutic sense.
Yeah.
Tragedy as emotional detox or a moral lesson.
Yeah.
But your reading feels way darker and more honest. Like tragedy isn't a cure, it's a mirror.
Right.
So here's my push. Could we say that the real work of tragedy for Aristotle, and maybe for us too, is really to like interrupt consolation, to insist that there is no closure?
Yeah. The distinction that you're describing there, Leigh, between the standard kind of evaluations of the value of tragedy, that it either gives this emotional release or it teaches you a moral lesson, a kind of rule to live by. And I think if you read a lot of tragedy, a lot of Greek tragedy, and a lot of really effective modern tragedy, that's not what it's providing, right? Mm-hmm. And so it is a bit of a mystery to figure out, why did 17,000 Athenians fill the theater once a year and watch 9 tragedies where it's just a catastrophe every time? You know?
Great concessions.
Yeah.
Peanuts! Get your peanuts!
Let's go out to the lobby. Let's go out to the lobby.
I remember that song.
I do too.
But I think you're right to say there's a kind of interruption of a unjustified settling into presumed truths, accepted opinions. It sort of presents you with the requirement that you confront the unknowability of the influences that are at work on you, that are participating in the way you experience the world, the way you reflect on the world, that give you the concepts you use to make sense of the world and direct your decisions, not just giving you your values, but giving you all those kind of fundamental elements of how you interrogate your own values. And that problematic situation, I think, is what tragedy presents you with on the one hand. And then the impossibility of knowing, once you've done your reflection and deliberated about your possible decisions and actions you could take, how can you get yourself to act knowing full well the ultimate consequences of your action are not totally, but are always inevitably out of your control? And I think that idea, you're totally right. It is a pretty dark view of the human condition.
Yeah.
But I would just say that's what makes it so fascinating to then go to Aristotle's Ethics and see, okay, can we read this as a kind of toolbox for responding to precisely this tragic condition, for trying to pursue something like arete or excellence or virtue, however you want to translate it, in spite of these really challenging features of our human temporality.
You're probably aware, Sean, that there are a lot of theories of tragedy. My same teacher, Rainer Schurman, has one, but you find it also in Derrida, reading it as someone being caught in what they call a double bind, which is a concept that comes initially from psychology, but they both use it to talk about tragedy. And the idea is the tragic character, the tragic player, is caught between two laws that are both binding on them, and they can't not act, but acting will violate one law. And so I think the tragedy of Antigone shows this really well, that there are two really binding laws, a law of the gods or of the religious cult on the one hand, and then the law of the city on the other hand. She needs to do something. She can't not act, but she's violating one law or the other. I find your interpretation sort of has a double bind, but reads it a little bit differently. The double bind is humans, by definition, are prone to err. Maybe that's not exclusive to humans, but it is certainly part of what it is to be human. And yet we have to act. Those two together mean we could always go wrong, as I pointed out before, and as you just pointed out, go wrong in the very attempt to achieve my happiness, my virtue, a good life even, that in trying to achieve it, we actually achieve the opposite.
I like this point that both of you are bringing out about the kind of ethical life that time demands, because if we're always judging after the fact, if our understanding always comes too late, then ethics isn't going to be about perfect foresight or moral clarity. It's just going to be about living well with the inevitability of missing the moment. And that's a much messier ethics, but, maybe a much more humane one too.
Right. Yeah. I like the idea of it being humane in the sense that we have this requirement that you're both sort of pointing to, that we have to take action, we have to live our lives, and we have to make decisions. We're ethically called upon, we're responsible to act in the world, interact with others, and initiate changes in the world. And in that condition, we can't ever arrive at any certainty about what the consequences will be, or whether the action we're taking is the product of a previous influence, a kind of fateful force that, even if we don't think of that in divine terms, we could think about it in very contemporary historical terms. I have certain prejudices and biases and tendencies that are a product of my historical context directing me in one way or another. And I can't fully either understand or take charge of them. They're working their way through me no matter what. And so instead of looking at that condition and saying, well, I guess there isn't any ethics anymore, it's just about historical determination and indeterminacy, insisting, no, there is a way of successfully inhabiting that position, or if success is kind of a dubious term, maybe healthy, in a healthy way. Not ever transcending or escaping or circumventing those constraining aspects of our finitude in temporal terms, but nonetheless taking them on and seeking to act in a way that we aspire to call ethical, that we believe we can say is an ethical action, even if in the very next moment we have to then reconsider, was that the right thing to do? Right? There's a necessary openness to reconsideration, a kind of deferral of ultimate judgment on the value of anything that comes out of this. And maybe that's really where that humane character comes in, Leigh, that it's hard to condemn anything in that way as well, completely or fully, because the values are always requiring reconsideration in a way.
Yeah.
I want to push back on this, and I want to start by saying I'm not sure I would maintain this argument, but let me just try it out. You say that what tragedy in the classic Greek context does is bring something to our attention that then, you said earlier, we might turn to the ethics, Aristotle's ethics, to see how do we live within this very condition that tragedy brings to our attention. That seems to me to say that tragedy just really basically says, in your face. In the sense of like, you do your best, as the stranger says in The Big Lebowski, sometimes you eat the bear, sometimes the bear eats you.
Yep.
And so it's just sort of pointing this out that, hey, this is just what it is to be human. Sorry, I'm out of here. Tip your servers.
Yeah, you're right to say that in a way, tragedy diagnoses a insurmountable problem and just sort of drops it in your lap and says, don't forget about this.
Right.
But maybe the way to think about the value is to think about the way in which an awareness of that indeterminacy or that temporal situatedness between an unknowable past and an unknowable future, maybe the way to think about the value of that is to think about the kinds of dogmatism and the kinds of self-assertion, the kinds of behaviors that an awareness of that condition disallows. And so maybe there's where the value is. It doesn't really give you a way of remedying the condition, but it does eliminate certain things that I think we can say lead down paths of vicious human activity, and at least problematizes those. It's difficult to engage in some of those kinds of self-assertive, dominating, self-certain, self-righteous, more than anything, ways of being, if you're aware of these kind of essential constraints or essential aspects of your finitude.
This is more of a meta comment, but one of the things I loved the most about your book is that it just completely blows up the idea that philosophy is or ought to be a presentist endeavor.
Right.
Like, you're not trying to drag Aristotle into the present. You're asking, what can the past teach us about how we got stuck in this metaphysics of presence in the first place?
Right.
And maybe that is more a question for your next book, but how do you see your argument about tragic temporality unstick ourselves and, get unstuck in where we are?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think about it a lot because I teach a lot of Aristotle. And so I have to step into the classroom and say, hey, everyone. There's a reason to read this together. I love Aristotle. He's my philosophical person. He just gets me. I do love him.
You vibe.
Not everyone does. So I realize that. I do feel like I have to make an argument for why we should be reading this. And my argument has to do with looking at this tradition of presentism or this tradition of the metaphysics of presence and thinking that we find ourselves, if we follow Nietzsche and Heidegger and some of the thinkers of the 20th century, as kind of epigons coming at the late waning moment of this tradition. Maybe it's changing into something else. Maybe we're in a postmodern or post-metaphysical age, or maybe we're not. But we definitely experience the tradition as having gone over a trajectory and placing us in this position where its fundamental principles and values seem questionable, and we feel the necessity of thinking in radically different terms in order to address some problems that seem to be the product of this tradition. Issues of exclusion and marginalization and violence and oppressive tendencies that we see that seem to be grounded in this tradition that we want to try to begin to think beyond in fundamentally different ways. I think that position actually is kind of contemporaneous with the Aristotelian position as the inaugurator of that tradition. So what we find in his thinking is the elements of that tradition before they're completely formed, before they've become sort of accepted and certain truths. They're concepts that are in the moment of Genesis. And so if we read his text really carefully, we find him wrestling with, for instance, the definition of a substance, right? So he's inaugurating basically substance metaphysics, the idea that what is in the world are a collection of more or less independently existing, unified, knowable entities. And that's what the world is made out of. He's not an atomist. He's not a materialist in some kind of natural philosophy way. He's a substance metaphysician, and he generates this notion out of an experience of the world that's not yet organized by the concept of substance. And so if we can get back to a moment where his thinking is wrestling with possibilities and aspects of experience that ultimately are eclipsed and sort of left behind when he inaugurates the tradition that we inherit, it might be the case that that provokes us and gives us a conversation partner for thinking here at the other end of metaphysics, where we're trying to push beyond, say, the notion of substances, the notion of essentially defined entities, the idea of fixed identities, or those kinds of things. We want to entertain other ways of thinking. I think Aristotle becomes actually a really helpful and generative conversation partner because of our shared historical position with respect to this kind of tradition.
I'm really jealous of your students because the Aristotle that you're presenting is a far, far cry from the smug, everything in its place Aristotle that I think a lot of us got in undergraduate philosophy courses. And, really, the more you talk, it sounds to me like I'm not saying that Aristotle was a proto-existentialist, but you're giving us a kind of existentialist Aristotle, being as involving a kind of anxiety, time as attention, tragedy as a mode of truth-telling. Is there anything to that? Do you see something like a existential Aristotle emerging from your reading?
You're absolutely right, Leigh. And I hadn't thought in those terms, but as you're posing that question, I think there is something like that because of the way that we map out the four causes and how they constitute the individual in most cases. That is, we think of the efficient cause, the formal cause, and the final cause as all the same in these kind of fixed identities. And we put them up on the blackboard and we say, this is the human that is the parent, this is the human form that this individual human has. And it looks very settled, like there's not much in question. And by the way, this has an essential definition. It's the zoon, logon, echon. It's the animal with reason or language. And so everything's settled and the human is kind of situated in this really comfortable determining structure. But if now these things are sort of inherently and insuperably questionable in our actual relation to them, then I think we do get something like an existential openness and indeterminacy, a kind of question of our being, which is inevitably part of that condition in which we're always capable of erring, right? There's a reason that dogs always seem to produce dogs, but we humans, when we produce ourselves in our lives, we often produce monsters. It's because of that openness to error that is quasi-existential or has a lot of resonances with existential philosophy.
It seems to me, though, that the way you just got to that existentialism was through Aristotle's practice, as you argue for it in this book and elsewhere, of observing the world around him And I think you rightly point out something that people tend to forget, that Aristotle wrote more about animals and biology and so on than he did about ousia, about substance or about knowledge. And so part of the way you get to this existentialism is by Aristotle looking at the world, investigating it, maybe sometimes dissecting it, and saying, okay, is there a way in which this could be understood? Then the idea of something like a form, that could be understood not as a stable, static essence, but, as you point out several times in the book, as the way in which a thing has parts that hold together throughout all sorts of changes, but they do hold together and maintain a certain thisness to them over time. That's a whole other notion of form. It's an existential notion of form, but it's arrived at by means of observation of what appears, or, to speak like philosophers, a phenomenology.
Yeah, I agree with that, Rick. And I think it's a really nice description of what I think is there in Aristotle, this observation of living things and how they accomplish their being. And instead of thinking of the form as a kind of structuring shape, that's how we tend to imagine eidos functioning in Aristotle, that you have a bunch of matter which is not yet shaped into something we recognize as human or oak tree or wolverine or whatever. In that forming, then we wind up with a concrete instantiation of one of those living things. But I do think for Aristotle, the way the form actually organizes the matter in each case, and the way he sees it organizing the material elements of the body in the living activity of living things, is much more dynamic and almost quasi-event-like.
Yeah.
It's as though the individual is sort of accomplishing its being at every moment, that the organizing of the functions of the individual organs and etc. into a cooperating activity that sustains the individual living thing through time. It's almost like that is an emergence at every moment, rather than a fixed, self-identical movement through time coming out of the possibility of non-being and into its existence each time, each moment the individual exists.
If it's okay, I'd like to step away from the physics and the metaphysics and back to the poetics, just to pick up on exactly this point, because one of the things that you argue in your third chapter is that the poetics isn't just about drama, it's staging this deep truth about human temporality. So here's my question. When Aristotle says that a tragedy is a complete action, is that philosophical shorthand for this is what it looks like to be a human being caught in time?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, and he does give us that feature that the action that's depicted on stage, in order to really function well and serve the aim of tragedy, it has to be a complete action. And I think his idea there is that the action, what it will ultimately produce, that can't be left out of the imitation of the action, because for Aristotle, tragedy should or must impose on its subject matter a kind of orderly structure. It has to have a beginning, middle, and an end. It has to have a certain magnitude, right? It can't be 35 days long.
Yeah, because there are 7 of these we've got to watch. So
That's right. So move it along. So there are these requirements in order for it to serve its function, but one of them is that it has to be completed. And I think that has to do less with Aristotle's insistence that all human action is complete, and more with it has to arrive at what it internally, this action, this activity of Antigone, this activity of Orestes, of deciding to revenge the murder of his father and kill his mother, it has to come to its end precisely in order to sort of explode that end and show the unanticipatable consequences that follow. So it has to always have a presumed beginning. Oh, I'm going to kill my mother because she killed my father. That's exploded immediately in tragedy by everyone's understanding of the mythical past of Agamemnon and the house of Atreus and the curse of the house and etc. that's contributing to that origination. But Orestes treats the murder of his father as though it were the origin of his action. And then it has to come to an end the murder of his mother, and then the Furies swarm into effect and chase him all over Greece. And so now we have the presumed end of the action exploded and sort of indicating what will follow, the aimed at closure of the action. So I think he wants the beginning and the end to be established precisely so they can be problematized in tragedy.
It's almost as if what happens, from the point of view of the tragic spectator, what happens is, as you say repeatedly, not just about feeling pity and fear.
Right.
It's about realizing that we only ever really understand what's happening to us when it's too late.
Yeah.
And it's staging that for us.
Yeah, exactly. And that pity and fear aspect, it is important, but I think my sense for Aristotle is the thing we need to think about when we think, Aristotle says it will be a catharsis of pity and fear that tragedy accomplishes. Pity and fear are sort of foregrounded as the affects that are involved in. I think their function is always as a pair, because if you think about how pity and fear work, I don't really fear for another person. Fear is something I feel for myself. My own safety is jeopardized, and then I feel fearful. I can sort of metaphorically say I fear for you, but that's a metaphorical expansion of the fundamental meaning of the term. I fear for myself, and then I pity another person when their safety is threatened or they suffer. I can also say I'm characterized by self-pity, but again, it's a metaphorical kind of extension. Mm-hmm. So I think when he puts together pity and fear, he's trying to describe the really complicated way we relate to the tragic protagonist, Leigh, that you were just thematizing as audience members, where we partly identify with Antigone so that we fear the catastrophe we know is coming, but we also partly don't identify with Antigone, and therefore we pity her. Mm-hmm. And it's that kind of quasi-identification, I think, that Aristotle thinks is necessary for learning this lesson, this idea that you're pointing out, that we never know what the right action was except in retrospect. And even then, it seems like the ultimate consequences are still as yet unknown. And so that lesson is something we need to be pitying and fearing the tragic protagonist in order to derive.
Heads up, listeners, we left Twitter. We packed up, shut the lights off, and logged out permanently. Not because it stopped being fun, but because it stopped being ethical. So if you're looking for us online, don't go lurking in Elon's hellscape anymore. Instead, follow us where the real conversation happens, on Blue Sky. That's where we're sharing our episode updates, behind-the-scenes content, and all the half-baked takes we used to share on Twitter. If you love what we do here, don't just sit there. Press pause now and go follow us. You can find us at Hotel Bar Sessions on Blue Sky. No ads, no bots, no billionaire nonsense, just the good stuff. And it is our very strong preference that we keep our conversation with you going on that platform. Of course, you can also find us on Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube, and we appreciate your likes or follows on all of those platforms. Now, back to the conversation.
As both of you know, I'm currently writing a book on the history of the philosophy of comedy. And Sean, you mentioned that Aristotle says in the Poetics that at some point he's going to talk about comedy. It's a very bizarre line. He says something like, blah, 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 but this will have to wait until we talk about comedy. It doesn't exactly say that there's going to be a whole other book to this text, the Poetics. It just indicates we're going to talk about this again. But in writing about comedy, one thing it shares with tragedy is Aristotle's focus on the ethos of the individual involved. I'm trying to avoid saying character. By character, I mean this person, Agamemnon.
Right.
And often ethos gets translated as character. Obviously, you know this better than I do, but I think when Aristotle's talking about ethos, he's talking about something more like what I would call a way of life. And what's interesting about a way of life is that in many ways, it can't be individual. So one thing I think about, and this is well known to our faithful audience, I rotate my dishes. The clean ones, when they come out of the dishwasher, I put them under the ones that are already on the shelf or behind the glasses. That's not a way of life. That's a neurosis or worse. And one reason why it's not a way of life is because it's not shared, or it's definitely not something we would want to share. And so this notion of ethos that is central to both comedy and tragedy, that is, to drama, seems to already open up to the society, including a society that is this political community, these relatively small Greek states. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, how does Aristotle's notion of ethos fit into your understanding of tragedy first, but then more so, does that open this issue of tragic temporality onto the realm of social thinking and political thinking?
Maybe the starting point would be to think about that term ethos that does refer to character or protagonist or figure or individual actor in a given tragedy. In the Poetics is also a central term in Aristotle's Ethics. And there he is talking about something like character, ethos, but he puts it in relation to another Greek term, a related Greek term, ethos, which is something like custom or a habit. So I think for him, when he's thinking about an ethos, a way of life, he is always thinking about a way of being accustomed to living. And for him, that accustoming of an individual to live a certain way is always social-political.
Right.
It always happens in a human community. It involves the role of the family, the role of education, the role of laws, all of which basically train us to live a certain kind of life. And so when he takes that ethos out of the Poetics and moves it into the Ethics, I take that to be a sense that we're in the political space very clearly. He's thinking about virtue ethics, but he's thinking about virtue ethics as a way of pursuing excellence or living well that has always already been habituated in a certain social context.
Right.
So you're the recipient of all of these different values, all of these different tendencies of thought, all of these different principles, etc., whether you want to accept them and affirm them or not. And now the question is, how do you act and pursue your happiness given that always already habituated condition?
And I think your example of Orestes fits in really nicely here, because there's a way in which his killing his mother assumes, or he assumes in killing his mother, that I am going to act, this act is going to decisively avenge or decisively change the context.
Right.
But the problem is his act is within an entire social, cultural milieu, as you pointed out, in which Agamemnon also sacrificed his daughter.
Yep.
That might have something to do with why his mother killed his father.
Yep.
And we all know that sitting in the audience. And so this way of acting, this habitual way of acting that you point out, is something that we can all recognize because we share this space of political values, social values, and cultural values.
And I think this gets back to something that Sean was just saying before about the completeness of a tragedy. You know, there's this moment in the Poetics where Aristotle very clearly says that tragic action has to be a whole, right? It has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Mm-hmm. But in our actual human lives, it never feels that clean, right? It's always fragmented. It's always misfiring. It's always cut short. That leads me to think that we might be able to say that tragedy stages a kind of idealized teleology, not because it reflects life as it is, but because it shows us what is structurally possible and impossible. Like the completeness of a tragic action is precisely what exposes the brokenness of human agency. Mm-hmm. Now, I want to, if I can, tie that in with another question. You also make the point that the Poetics might be Aristotle's most profound philosophical work, and that's kind of a mic drop claim, right? So do you think, given what it is tragedy is staging for us and what it is that we're realizing about the tragic temporality that is the existence of the kinds of beings that we are, do you think that if this is the most philosophical text, that philosophy should take a few cues, right, from tragedy and maybe stop trying to be so tidy, so triumphal.
Right.
Not necessarily move in the entire doom and gloom sense, but in the structural sense that you describe, cultivate different kinds of thinkers. Like, what kinds of thinkers do we need to become?
That's a great question, really, perfectly. And it has to do with something I've been thinking about in the context of reading Nietzsche. I think this kind of opens up to Rick's frequent point of resistance with respect to my focus on tragedy, his insistence that comedy gives us another tool for thematizing that brokenness, that finitude, that exposure, that woundedness, that vulnerability, presenting it in terms that might be more generative than tragedy today. And Nietzsche is certainly someone who thought that. He thought we need to maybe start to think in what he calls comedic terms. He says in Zarathustra and after Zarathustra, maybe even prior to Zarathustra with the publication of The Gay Science, this idea that, well, maybe a joyousness and a kind of dancing way of thinking and a laughing way of thinking is what's required today. And I think he's thinking about something like the shift that Rick is suggesting, even though the idea that I'm connecting Rick with Nietzsche would drive Rick crazy, which is kind of half the motivation for doing it.
Well done, sir. Well done.
But I do think it's substantively right, too. But I think this idea, Leigh, that what kind of thinking, what kind of philosophizing might be able to draw in that recognition of incompleteness, the idea of insuperable indeterminacy, and still be philosophy. That's the thing. It wouldn't be just the end of philosophy, so now it's just a free-for-all or it's just a bunch of opinions, but somehow we continue on philosophizing, but we incorporate a recognition of these limitations. And I've been thinking more and more after doing a lot of work with Nietzsche that there's a kind of totalitarianism that is fundamental to the philosophical project that's not merely its political expression of totalizing control, but totalizing philosophical mastery. And that value is unjustifiable. The idea that philosophy, in order to pursue truth, in order to think in a responsible way about the content of our experience, requires a kind of quasi-totalitarian set of commitments, mastering everything, exhaustively illuminating everything, explaining rationally everything. Maybe that's a place to start. Is there a way to continue to think philosophically, to pursue truth, to respond responsibly to the content of our experience, but to kind of set aside what I'm calling a totalitarian requirement?
It seems to me, and this may be my own prejudice, but that's more or less the same as saying philosophy needs to be doing more ethical and political philosophy and less metaphysics.
Right. If it's interested in metaphysics, this goes back to Claudia Baracchi's book on Aristotle that I really learned a great deal from. But metaphysics has to be understood as sort of situated in a social political context. And therefore, in some way, first philosophy becomes the social political set of questions. And then we can start trying to get at what kind of being is showing itself in those social political questions and issues and contexts and et cetera. But the priority might be reversed in a way.
All right, now I feel like both of you are beating up on me. Sean, first of all, calls me a Nietzschean, and then Leigh is like, oh, we shouldn't do metaphysics anymore. Then I have no livelihood.
We really appreciate you for your service, Rick, and you can show yourself out.
But let me just say that a claim like maybe we need to stop doing metaphysics and start doing more social and political philosophy has the same structure of tragic temporality that Sean has been teasing out of tragedy. What I mean is, when I say we need to stop doing metaphysics, I don't understand what could be some of the catastrophic consequences of that very decision itself. If we think about that really as tragedy, I think we come closer to something that Sean teased out of Claudia Baracchi's work, namely, let's do metaphysics, but without the assumption that we are determining in a very precise and logical way the structure of what is.
I accept that friendly amendment wholeheartedly.
No, that's really nice. And I do think this is a central and maybe defining, not to be too magisterial in pronouncements, but it does feel like it's a central element of philosophical thinking today. It's a question that contemporary philosophy really needs to be wrestling with. That is there a way of thinking the concepts of metaphysics and epistemology and social political philosophy and holding those concepts in a way that's different from what traditional metaphysics required of us. The kind of precision, the kind of certainty, the kind of unchangeability, the kind of universality and exhaustion that we expected of our concepts. Is there a way to still continue to do what philosophy has always done, create concepts and think with concepts, but now those concepts are sort of held in a different way, or they have a different status? Yeah. And here's where I'm sort of at the limit of what I'm even able to imagine we might want to be thinking about.
What I think you're pointing to is the fact that we should understand concepts as having a way of life of their own.
Nice.
That is, they could have virtues, which includes the education, development, habitual way of responding to things. We tend to think of concepts as dead, fixed, defined once and for all.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, I'm sorry to say I have something tragic to announce, and that is that our bartender is giving us last call.
That is tragic time right there.
It is tragic time. I'm just going to start referring to last call as tragic time now.
If that's one consequence of this book, then that's enough for me, Leigh.
But before we get out of here, I just want to thank you so much, Sean, for this absolutely fantastic conversation. I feel like I've learned a lot, not just from your book, but maybe even more from being able to talk with you about it today. For our listeners, if you haven't gotten it yet, go out and pick it up. It's called Aristotle and Tragic Temporality, published by Edinburgh University Press just this year. Wherever you buy books, buy it, but we may encourage you especially to buy it from the EUP website.
And maybe as a secret, the discount code we have given in the past has not been taken down, so try it at checkout and you could get 20% off.
That's great. Thank you so much for having me, Leigh and Rick. This has really been sincerely a genuine pleasure and really illuminating and generative for me. I really appreciate the conversation.
All right. Well, we will keep you on our list of people to come back. I would love to have you back, so please keep us in mind as well.
Good night, y'all.
Good night.
Good night.